SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. And as part of that goal, we've partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: rebuilding efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. And with that, I will pass it on to our Senior Government Advisor, J.R. Sanderson.
Hey, good morning. So thankful to have all you folks joining us today. So thank you for joining us for our webinar series. We do have some upcoming webinars. We've listed them here. We are also next year going to produce about 15 webinars. So we will be publishing that complete list. All of our webinars, as you well know, are done on Wednesdays at about this time. But we would ask that you join us on October 12th for HUD proofing. In November, we're going to talk about decision making and disaster recovery, and in December, we're going to talk about organizational effectiveness. All of our webinars are listed on our Advise webpage. We do have some upcoming leader practitioner course training. If you'd like to join us for this, we are conducting the mitigation focused practitioner course in September, but we are full up for that. And we're filling up very, very fast for our November 8 to 10 course, which will be held in New Orleans. Next year, we will begin looking at doing some courses in Savannah, Georgia. And our first one will be specifically 9 to 12 January in Savannah. We are looking to go to the West Coast sometime in the May timeframe next year. And of course, we're going to continue to do our mitigation-focused training throughout America next year. So if you're interested, let us know. Of course, this is paid for. Your travel expenses, lodging, and instruction course materials, all paid for by the generous grant from the Walmart Foundation. Next chart, please. So one of the things I would call your attention to and ask that you, if you're interested in this, please contact us, because we are going to hold a Finance for Effect course. We all know how critical finance is in both CDBG-DR and CDBG-MIT operations. So this is a course dedicated for finance leaders. We're going to hold this in Savannah, Georgia. We'll do this 6 to 8 February. So if your finance folks on your team are interested in this, we'd love to have you. We've got seats available. This is a cost course, so we do charge $2,200 per seat. But we do believe that it would be well worth your time in terms of learning all the specifics associated with DRGR reports that you can pull out, looking at your finance operation and ensuring yourself that you're doing all the right things from a financial standpoint. So encourage you to come and attend this one. Next chart, please. We always encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. This is how we generally communicate with folks. So we'd ask that you join us there. Next chart, please. So today, I'm going to spend some time talking about the common pitfalls and some negative trends that we are seeing in mitigation. Now, I need to add a qualifier in here and say that we all know that we lost probably somewhere between 12 and 24 months due to COVID. So when I say negative trends here, oftentimes that is associated with folks just not being able to move as fast as they would like to have moved due to COVID. So keep that in mind as we go through it. The other thing I would say is that anytime we talk about a negative trend, all we're saying here is that it is a trend and it can most certainly be reversed. So ask you to think about that. Let's go to the next chart, please. So in overview, let's be mindful, we got 2 types of grants out there. We have the standalone CDBG-MIT grant, which many folks now are working on. And candidly, that will be generally the major focus of what I'm going to talk about here today. Having said that, the recent Federal Register releases have mandated a 15% expenditure on mitigation, and we will be covering some parts of that. The legacy grant, of course, was 12 years. The DR grants were 6 years. And as I said earlier, all negative trends can be reversed. Next chart, please. we talked to several experts in the field as we put this together, and I'm thankful for their input. One of the things I will say about us here at SBP is that we are kind of like Farmers Insurance in that we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. And I thank you all out there who are talking to us and telling us what you're seeing, because it does help other grantees, and we're all appreciative of that. So the first negative trend we're seeing here is the ability to select viable sub-recipients. So when you're talking about sub-recipients, this is certainly akin to regular CDBG grants. So some of this may be commonsensical to you. But one of the things we're seeing here is that grantees continue to fail to establish criteria and vet potential sub-recipients. Now, not all sub-recipients are equal. We all know that. One of the great mysteries that happens in America now is that we have some high performing counties, some what we refer to in this business as high capacity counties. Those are counties that have high tax bases. They have able and capable and numerous public administrators. And then we have low capacity counties. Some of those low capacity counties, you may have folks who are working 40 to 50 hours a week just to make sure that they maintain the basic services because they have a diminished tax base or a plethora of other reasons. So the thing that we would say here is that we absolutely have to select sub-recipients who are fully capable of executing this mission in a timely manner and to report the outcomes of the mission. So that's the first negative trend we're seeing. But what I would also like to talk about next chart is how do we reverse that? So the thing that we will argue to people is that in order to reverse this trend, we ask that you have a grading criteria for your sub-recipients, and we ask you to put that in policy. We think that is a good way for you to be fair and equitable in the distribution of grant funds. And it's very similar to what HUD does to you. As most of you know, a new grantee in this business, HUD's going to conduct a risk assessment on you. So what we would say to you is do the same thing to your sub-recipients. This will minimize your risk. This will give you the capability of looking out and seeing which sub-recipients you think are going to be able to adequately execute the mission that you've given them with the funds that you've given them. And at the bottom bullet down here, we talk a little bit about the sub-recipient must have the capability and capacity to execute their portion of the grant. Now, when I talk about capability, that is the intellectual capability to carry out. Most of the people we're dealing with here are very, very smart. So let's not take that in a negative light. However, we may not have enough of them. So capacity is how many people do we have? We all know that low capacity counties in America may have multiple people doing multiple jobs for the county, or the unit of local government, or the council of government, or the nonprofit. So one of the things that we have to do before we begin passing money down the chain is ensure that we have both the capability and the capacity to execute that grant. And the question we got to continue to ask ourselves is, can that subrecipient get the outcome that we want? Because we're the ones that wrote the action plan. And while it is certainly possible for HUD to go out and look at a subrecipient, folks, that's a pretty rare occurrence. And what I will say is that, they're holding you accountable. You are the person that's being held accountable, the grantee. So let's just think about it. If I'm going to pass this money down, can that subrecipient give me the outcomes that I want? Let's go to the next chart. Talk about a negative trend here too, which is basically a lack of subrecipient visibility. You need to be able to monitor your subrecipient's progress. We are seeing grants, especially in mitigation across America now, where some of the larger states may have 1 to 200 subrecipients. Folks, that is a lot to manage. That is a tremendous amount to manage. And so what we advocate for strongly, we beg you, we cajole you, is to work on a standardized system of record, an information technology system of record that enables what we call total asset visibility. Folks, we need to look at this from a business standpoint. We're getting far, far more like Walmart or some other major industry in the disaster recovery business than we used to be. And what I would say to you is we don't have total asset visibility over what money we have and where that money's going. We're probably going to have some problems along the line. So we beg people to work on the standardized system of record. And if we don't have that, if we can't get a standardized system of record, then one of the things that we ask people to do is have a very, very strong policy-based reporting protocol, where you require those people who are the sub-recipients to report. And if they don't report, then you send them a nice letter saying, look, you're out of compliance here. So I know that there are dozens of reasons for not having a standardized system of record. But I see this all the time everywhere in the disaster recovery business. And many of you out there, I think, would agree with me when I say that if you're a multi-million-dollar business or a billion-dollar business, folks, you can't run that off of SharePoint, in my opinion. Now, you may disagree with me, and if you do, send me an email and we'll discuss it. But one of the things that happens when we talk about standardized systems of record, next chart, please, is that we see oftentimes that we get into squabbles, right? The IT folks will say, no, we don't need this, or somebody will say, do we really need another system of record, or can't this system do it? And I know that there are dozens of systems of records out there. But what I would say to you is you need to get something you're happy with and your people can work with. Otherwise, you're just going to lose visibility. And candidly, this entire mitigation program is a fight for visibility. And if you can't have a fight for visibility, if you don't know what's going on, you're going to have a real hard time making decisions. You're going to have a real hard time making adjustments. And candidly, my gut tells me there's going to be a tremendous amount of substantial amendments that are going to come out of this. Now, you may agree or disagree with me, but you can send me an email and we could discuss it. If you can't get to a centralized reporting system, IT system of record, and you can't, and your policies are weak, then what I would say to you is please focus on your centralized finance system, because you're going to have to know where the money was going, because that's what's going to keep you out of trouble. Again, we strongly believe in a strong reporting system, and we do believe strongly in being able to communicate with sub-recipients who are out of variance and saying, look, you're out of variance here. Here's your note. We need to work on it. And you're going to have all this data for your quarterly performance report, your QPR. So again, the biggest problem that we see here is a lack of total asset visibility, and we strongly recommend a universal system of record. We think that you certainly have the money for that, especially large grantees, even small grantees, and we just think it's that critical. So let's go to the next chart, please. So we are also seeing a lot of folks in the mitigation world today who are working off an application-based system. So what we would say to you is that if you're taking applications, if you're using an applicant-based system in which sub-recipients certainly can be nonprofits, units of local government, councils of government, counties, cities, all the folks who may apply, we ask that you take the time and build a complete application before you begin sending that out. Now, I'm not an advocate ever for slow bureaucracies. Having said that, what I would say to you is make sure your application's right before you put it on the street. That sounds very simplistic, but I will tell you that I've heard multiple stories of folks building applications and then sending them out and saying, wait a minute, that's not right. That's not the data we needed. And all that's doing is frustrating everybody in the system. And I know you are under pressure to get the money out the door. I got that. The other thing that I would say to you about sub-recipient applications is the application itself is no guarantee they're going to get the money. And I would just make that clear to people in that, it's just the first step, and that will culminate certainly in a sub-recipient agreement. Next chart. And of course, a sub-recipient agreement, as you will hear us say oftentimes, is a contract. So, we're taking the application to determine the capability, which we already talked about, and the capacity for them to execute. The other thing I would say here is that, in both DR and mitigation, sub-recipients must have skin in the game. If they don't have skin in the game to be able to meet your requirements as the grantee, then everything does tend to fall apart. So it's about a contract here, and that's what we're working toward. We want to contract people. We want that contract to be strong and solid. You can call it a sub-recipient agreement. Many states and grantees now have standardized the sub-recipient agreement, so it's one form, fits everybody. That's a pretty good methodology. But what I would say to you is it's got to be right. It's got to be right. So things to think about, especially in the application system. Let's go to the next chart. Monitoring. Folks, this is pretty straightforward. You get what you inspect. The more you monitor, the more you know, the better decisions you're going to make as a grantee. And if you don't know what's going on out there, then you're gonna have failure. One of the things that I would say here, though, across in multiple programs that we've seen, and this is certainly true in both DR and mitigation, is that if you have desk-bound monitoring and compliance folks, you're probably going to have a lot of failure, because here's what's going to happen. The desk-bound compliance folks, and again, I'm throwing rocks here, so feel free to throw them back at me. But if desk-bound compliance folks are going to find something well after it's happened, and it will be as reactive as possible. What you want is you want to be able to make good decisions in a timely manner, and you want to be proactive. And so if you've got problems out there, you want to proactively fix those problems as best you can. Let's don't be reactive and wait till it blows up in our face and it hits the front page of the newspaper wondering where that money went before we begin taking a great interest in it. So let's go to the next chart. In order to reverse this, what I would say to you is, the monitoring schedule is absolutely critical. The other thing I would say is don't be cheap. One more time for all my public administrators and dear friends in the bureaucratic world, and you all know I'm a recovering bureaucrat, don't be cheap. One more time, don't be cheap. You have got to have monitoring and compliance as an integral part of anything you're doing in mitigation. That means that you're going to need to ensure that these folks can move around and travel, and that needs to be added to your internal budget. And you're going to have to read their reports and make them write reports that mean something to you. And with that, that will give you the information. So in order for you to make decisions, you have to know things, and they're going to give you what you need to know in order to make a decision. And the bottom line here is you need to monitor this. This needs to be something that we're continuing to do across the board. A lot of states have pretty good programs here for monitoring and compliance. Some of you, however, no. Some of you are failing miserably in this category, and frankly, it's evident. It doesn't take folks long to figure out where you're failing. So things to think about here. Let's go to the next chart. In terms of acquisition and buyout, these are extremely complex missions. And one of the things that we say to people here is that we're seeing oftentimes acquisition and buyout programs that are being rolled out, and candidly, they may be or are way too immature to be rolled out. So before you begin rolling out an acquisition and buyout program, two separate terms there, right, depending on end use, before you roll that out, what we say to people is, look, you need to have thought through this end to end. You need to have policy in place. If you're going to do incentives, a lot of people nowadays are doing incentives for a wide variety of reasons: moving incentives, low to moderate income incentives, incentives to stay in the county in order to protect the tax base. You need to know what your process is going to be, and you need to know the payment methodology in the process, and you need to know the end use of that property. I will tell you that probably one of the hardest things about acquisition and buyouts: who owns the property when you're done. Counties do not want to own that property because now they have a maintenance responsibility toward it. So getting to end use, getting to all this sorted out before you roll out an acquisition, now it may take a while. This is going to take a lot of talking, and it's going to take a lot of strategy. It's going to take a lot of people working together collaboratively to get to a good policy that'll work for you. But again, this really tears the world up when we roll it out too early. When we're not fully and completely prepared to roll this out, and we roll it out too early, it's going to just lead us to a lot of pain and heartache, I believe. Let's go to the next chart. So real simple rules here. All of you know this, so I'm not trying to talk down to anybody, but you got to do your homework before you roll this out. And you got to get this thing about right. Now, you're never going to be perfect. Nothing in DR and mitigation is perfect. So what I will tell you is you need to get it about right. You need to have it about right in terms of all these things up here. What is the sub-recipient policy, right? What's the process flow? What's the payment methodology? What's the end use of the property going to be? And of course, we always encourage people to build an administrative policy process for those things that are outside of the norm. What do you do when somebody dies? What do you do when you have this problem or that problem? We believe strongly in that. So the bottom line here, I think, is that you have to organize for success. If you're going to roll out an acquisition and buyout program, which is a big part of mitigation here, moving people away from water, then we ask that you do your homework first. and that know that nothing here is self-synchronizing. If you think that this is simply going to all fall into place, I'll argue that's a very wrong view of the world. And again, I will implore all of you, please do not roll out an immature program. If you roll out an immature program in this, especially if it's a state grantee rolling it out across 24, 26, or 50 counties, or in Texas, 300 counties or whatever y'all got, folks, this is going to blow up in your face. So make sure you're right before you roll it out. Common sense there, but felt like we needed to add that trend in because we are kind of seeing that in some places in America today. Let's go to the next chart. This is my favorite one. And here you get to hear JR sing for you. I know you all look forward to that. What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, bad boys. So I kind of like that. I've been practicing that all week, and thank you for the appreciation on that. So you're gonna have people who are gonna fail. I know that's shocking to you. That was said with sarcasm for those of you that missed it. So you are going to have people who are going to fail, who are sub-recipients. What are you going to do when they fail? So if you don't have, I call it a failure policy. Again, I'm a very direct person. You could call this a remediation policy, but you need to think through it. So a couple of things here you need to think about. How do you define failure? So how do we know if we've got a sub-recipient who's failing? We know from a HUD perspective, because HUD's going to tell us we're not spending the money, right? And you should know from an internal system of record point of view, but you need to define that. And as you define that, you put it in your policy. And then you need to ask yourself, okay, now you cannot just cut them off from the money. You need to figure out, how am I going to help them? Because the only way that all this works, folks, and you professional public administrators out there know this as just as well as I do, is that this needs to be a collaborative effort. So you need to figure out a way to give them a plan for assistance, right? What are you going to do to help them? Okay. And so how do you help your subrecipient, right? So the biggest thing, of course, is training and assistance. You can't do it for them, but you're going to have to go down there and do it. Now, one of the reasons that we see failure, I think, across America is that people change jobs, right? So a county or unit of local government may have been fired up to do this, and somebody retires, and it just goes into a dead space. And we got to revive that dead space. So the question you got to ask yourself is, what training and assistance can I provide? How can I do that? Do I have the capability to do that in my office, right? How long do you wait? A good question. So I think in your policy that I would encourage you strongly to say, look, we will not wait more than a month or two on this, because again, this is going to impact quarterly performance reports, QPRs that are coming out of your DRGR. What actions are you going to take? How are you going to communicate those actions? Who's involved? This can always turn out to be pretty ugly and political, having been involved in a couple of these in my career. And what I would say to you is that, you need to have a policy that says, if somebody below me, if I'm giving them money and they're failing, how do I handle this? And again, how do you warn of the consequences? I believe strongly in the idea that if somebody is not doing right down there, that we need to tell them quickly and efficiently. We need to be as upfront, as transparent, and as honest with them, and say, look, we need to fix this, and do whatever you got to do. But you need to warn also of the consequences. And when you start warning people of consequences, especially when you're talking about a federal grant that some politician is going to claim credit for, that can get explosive pretty quick. So let's talk about a couple of things in here that you could think about on the next chart for doing here. And that is, have a plan to immediately assist failing subrecipients. And I call that, of course, a failure policy. And again, here are all the things that I would add into it if I were doing it again. And I think at the bottom of it, probably the most important would be the notification protocol. And that would be, who all am I going to tell that this grant is failing? Normally, almost always, if you put it back into, especially if it's a state grantee dealing with a county, once that hits the county administrator or county judge's desk, they're going to say, wait a minute, I don't understand why we're failing here. Let me go put my nose into this and figure it out. And that gets solved pretty quick. What I think is failure, though, is if we have people out there as subrecipients who are failing month after month after month, and nobody's telling them they're failing. So again, what's the criteria for failure? Don't plan for a failure. I'm not trying to say to anybody in here, look, go out and plan for failure. What I am telling you is that we all live in the adult world. We all work in this hard thing called disaster recovery and mitigation. Folks, you're going to fail. Having said that, you need to have a plan for when you do fail, especially when dealing with mitigation sub-recipients across the board. The other thing that I would say here, go to the next chart, is that, when we talk about, this is something that I pulled out of the South Carolina folks who were very kind to me in this, and that is that when you're talking about centralized versus decentralized, if it is dealing with people, normally almost always in a DR program, I will argue that it needs to be a centralized program with centralized policy, centralized processes. If it's dealing with things, you can certainly do decentralized, right? And use sub-recipient agreements. Having said all that, I think it's important for us as administrators just to continue to think to ourselves, we are responsible for this grant. This is public dollars. And at some point, somebody's going to come along and say, where did this money go? And we need to think about how we're executing it and how we're administrating it. So not trends here, but 3 areas that I would say that you need to keep in mind. The first one is environmental requirements. The same environmental laws exist with the same federal dollar. So regardless of who's spending the money, this is a monitoring and compliance issue. Nobody gets around the federal environmental requirements here. The same thing happens with procurement requirements. It's interesting to me that, sometimes you send sub-recipient money downstream and it lands in a county, and all of a sudden, the procurements get real fuzzy. Folks, that can get to be real dangerous. So one of the things that we recommend to people is that we all have to understand what the rules of the game are. You have to have valid procurements. You have to have environmental requirements. All these are valid. And of course, we will encourage everybody time and time again to say that the sub-recipient agreement is a contract. It's a contract on you as the grantee, and it's also a contract on the person who's receiving the grant. Let's go to the next chart. So a couple of concluding thoughts here, right? Mitigation is critical. It is a critical thing that we absolutely have to be able to do, but it's not going to happen magically. This mitigation work is very, very hard work. And I would ask that you think to yourself, what happens if we don't mitigate? One of the things that's a little disheartening here is the idea that we have lost, somewhere between 12 and 24 months to COVID, and we didn't mitigate anything. We've been very, very fortunate so far this hurricane season, folks. We all need to be very, very thankful and prayerful that we don't have one. But it certainly could happen at any point, especially for those of us on the southeastern coast. So a couple of concluding thoughts here, just to put it into your head. Monitor what HUD monitors you on. So whatever HUD is monitoring you on in your last compliance inspection, then I would strongly encourage you to build something very similar. You can make it more stringent should you choose. And you monitor the people that you're processing money to, right? The other things that I would say to you is think about a couple of different major, buckets, if you will. Is it in accordance with policy? Do you have this written down somewhere? Normally, almost always, if you have a policy, you're going to be okay. Normally, almost always, if the procurement is legal and valid and above board, you're going to be okay. Normally, almost always, if you can account for duplication of benefits in the process, you're going to be okay. Normally, almost always, if you can account for the eligibility criteria, you need to determine who's eligible for what you're doing here. And you have to be able to account, of course, for your financial expenditures. So I am a checklist person. You can argue that that's part of my long time ago military background, but checklists work. And you take that checklist and you give it to the sub-recipients and say, hey, look, every 90 days, we're going to come down and we're going to follow this checklist. And we're going to look at you and we're going to look you in the eye, because we're not cheap and we know we have to know what's going on down here. Mitigation is critical. It's hard work. What I will say to everybody, though, is that if you build a systemic process, a routine process in which you can have visibility over these vast amounts of money that's coming into states, you're going to have a better outcome across the board. So with that, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, but if you have any, please fill them in. I know that was quick. I know it was down and dirty. But having said that, this is an immature subject, but we felt strongly today that we needed to talk about mitigation in this vein. We think it's important. And this is, of course, what we've seen so far. As we learn more, as we hear from you out there executing it, we'll add more and we'll continue to build this as we go. Let's go to the next chart, please.
Hey JR, there actually are a couple questions that came in the Q&A box.
Okay.
We were asked, are there examples of instances where prior performance on CDBG-DR grants presents a significant risk and causes them to not receive funding in a HUD most impacted and distressed area? And how is this navigated successfully?
Okay, well, that's a great question. I don't, while I know this business very well, I will say this, normally, almost always, when you have a disaster, because of the disaster process, right? The disaster process is presidentially declared normally almost always for both FEMA individual assistance and public assistance. And then, of course, it's going through Congress. So when Congress tells HUD, this is the disaster, HUD's going to write the Federal Register. There are lots and lots of people who have failed miserably with DR grants, yet they continue to get DR grants. So it's an interesting question. But what I will say to you is if you follow any of the math that HUD puts out in their monthly reports, what you will see very plainly is that at least 6 to 7 out of every 10 grantees in America is failing in terms of spending money at an appropriate rate. So even though they fail, when they have the next disaster, people come along and give them more money. One of the problems that we're seeing right now that we think is across public administration is that many of these states have got so much money. You're talking about ARPA funding, you're talking about COVID plus funding, you're talking about mitigation funding. And oftentimes what ends up happening is DR, disaster recovery, and mitigation, which is preparing for the next disaster and trying to mitigate against it. Those things tend to fall off the table. They become to be the last priority. And of course, they're going to stay that way until we get the next storm, and all of a sudden it tears it up again, and the storm then becomes the thing du jour of the day. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's an interesting question. So I will continue to study it. If you'd like to send me an email, we can discuss it more in detail. But I don't know of anybody who has not gotten a grant. Now, having said that, let's go back to the original question. There are people out there who have had problems with grants in the past, and as a result of that, have had they've become very high risk to HUD. HUD then puts their big thumb on them, and they'll add more people and put more people to do nothing but monitor that grant. I hate to use the term babysitting. That has happened to many of my friends in the Caribbean islands, where you've had HUD really put a strong thumb on them and candidly over monitor them in some ways. So yes, that has happened before, but again, it's a risk, right? So we need to determine if I'm going to give money to somebody, I need to ensure, just like a bank would do, that I'm allocating and accepting the acceptable risk level for me in order to give them the money. I don't know if that answered it or not. That's best I could do with that one. Olivia, give me the next one.
Okay, the other question we have is, could you elaborate further on how to incorporate the monitoring schedule to the sub-recipient agreement?
Yeah, I would say that, when you, again, it depends, right? So it's and I'm not trying to give a shaky answer here. If you have one system of record that touches all of your subrecipients and all of your grantees, then what's going to happen to you is you're going to be able to have what we call total asset visibility. Remember that you're running a business. If you're in the DR world and you're in a major grant state, and you're probably managing somewhere, I don't know, 500 to a million to $1 billion, you can afford to get a good system of record. And so I think what happens to us sometimes is that the question was on monitoring. And I think what happens to us is that we just kind of assume sometimes that the subrecipient agreement is good enough. What I would do is I would put in the contract, in the subrecipient agreement, these are your standard monitoring times. And then what we really want people to do is monitor themselves against a known standard. So the things that we talked about earlier in terms of building a known standard, and then all of us being able to see that. So we've got one goalpost. We don't ever want to be like FEMA, constantly moving the goalpost. I said that out loud, so you guys can send me lots of mean emails over that, but I believe it to be truthful. HUD doesn't normally do that. HUD will establish a standard and stick to it, and I'm proud of them for that. So I would put it inside the sub-recipient agreement, and so you can be monitored at any time, any place. Having said that, here's the monitoring schedule. And I would have a consistent monitoring schedule that went out, and I would make sure that my compliance team was on the road. Being real candid here, there are a couple of grantees that we've had the wonderful pleasure of working with. And candidly, you know, you go in and you ask the boss, the director, you say, are your grantees desk bound? And the grantee director will say, yes, they are desk bound. Well, then I will say, well, look, you don't have visibility on these things. You've got to get out and look. You've got to get out. You've got to see what, especially if you're running a DR housing program, you've got to be all over that. If you're running a mitigation program, you have to know where we're at with this, right? And if you don't have a system of record, even if you do have a system of record, you got to make sure that it's accurate. So one of the things that I would encourage people to do is, if you have a monitoring and compliance team, is to build your checklist and then have them write their reports, right? With a bottom line up front that says these folks are out of compliance or they're in compliance. So at least we know where we're going with that. I hope that answered that question, Libby.
Thanks, JR. That's all the questions we got. So we'll move on to the next slide.
Thank y'all for that. I appreciate the intellectual rigor there. I hope I answered them to the best of my, but if it didn't, email me and we'll talk about it. Here are the upcoming webinars for this year. Again, next year, we're looking at 15 webinars that we're going to try to put on. I'm very, very excited that we've got an environmental expert who's going to come in and do one whole webinar devoted to environmental stuff in DR. And I just think that's going to be awesome. We will begin publishing those next month. At the HUD proofing webinar, we'll begin pushing out all of our webinar schedule for next year. So we ask that you continue to join us, and we're thankful you're here today. Let's go to the next chart. Again, just to re-advertise the Leader Practitioner course, we're full for September. We're almost full for November. This is if you want to learn the blocking and tackling of community development block grants for disaster recovery, this is it, right? And we learn just as much from you as you do from us. But what we would also say is that you also learn from your peers. Some of the peer-to-peer relationships that take place in these are just beautiful and wonderful and great to watch. Again, we, SBP, we're going to fund this. We see this as a scholarship to grantees, and we pay for the lodging. We do reimburse your travel expenses up to $550, and we pay for all the course instructors, the great instructors that we've got coming in now from several different states. So this is probably the strongest cadre we've ever had in this program. We're real proud of that. Let's go to the next chart. Again, one more time, if you got finance people and you're in the DR and mitigation world, this is hard stuff. We're offering this course. Grantees ask us to put this on. We're using the great Michelle Stinnett as one of our primary instructors for this, and she is a genius on all this, as well as many other things. But specifically, we're going to talk about all the things we're going to need to do as a finance leader or a finance person, and all the reports that we can pull, and this makes us more efficient, right? We cannot afford to fail in finance. So again, unfortunately, this is a paid course, $2,200 per seat, Savannah, Georgia, 6 to 8 February. Please come and join us, and we'll set up a registration for you. Love to see you there. And I think this will be a great course for finance folks, as well as DR directors and leaders. Let's go to the next chart. A couple of other things that we do here at SBP Finance, SBP Advise, is we do offer, of course, the Leader Practitioner course, the Finance Leader course. We're going to offer one this year. For those of you that don't know this, and if you're interested in it, we do offer some other coursework. We teach the Disaster Manager course, which is a housing-centric course. We talk about the process of disaster recovery housing. This is a hard course. This is 3 days of looking at ECORs, estimated cost of repairs. How do we build process flows? How do we do a housing enterprise level area wide disaster housing mission? And that's a paid course. We also sell the acquisition and buyout course. So if you're doing acquisition and buyout, this is acquisition and buyout's only a day and a half. If you're interested in that, contact us. We believe that we have the best disaster case management training course on the planet. No disrespect to my dear friends at Red Cross or United Methodist or Catholic Charities, but ours is directly related to building case managers who can build the clientele for a CDBG-DR recovery. We also do program assessments. If your program is weak right now or you've got some problems in your program, contact us and we will talk to you about our assessment program. What we do generally in our assessment program is we bring in experts in the area that you're looking for, and we go and we look specifically in all areas of your organization. Normally it's 3 to 5 days on site, depending on how big you are. And this is far more intense than anything you're ever going to get from a HUD monitoring visit, because we're going to interview everybody and we're going to look at everything. And we only brief the boss. So when we walk out the door, we're only giving our feedback straight to the director and saying, here's where you're really, really pretty and beautiful and smart and sharp, and here's where you're really, really ugly, and you need to fix this or you're going to get in trouble. So we help determine strengths and weaknesses in our assessment program. Normally, almost always, you're going to need to procure us for that. So if you put out a competitive procurement, it'll be us and every other audit firm in America who will bid for it. You can choose how you want to choose with that, but we think we're not necessarily giving you an audit here. We're giving you a what's working and what ain't working. We're proud of that. A couple of workshops that we put on. We do the planning outcomes workshop. This is a great 3-day event in which we talk about the planning prior to execution. And we think that is a pretty good deal. And we do a management outcomes workshop for those of you that already have a grant and are working on it. So those are some of our advise offerings. If you're interested in any of that, go search our websites or give us a call or text or email. Let's go to the next chart. Follow us on LinkedIn. See, I'm getting really good at reading that. Follow us on LinkedIn. And so that's where we try to advertise that. Let's go to the next chart. And back to you, Olivia.
That's all we got. Thank you, JR, and thank you everyone for joining us on behalf of SBP and the Walmart Foundation. I will be sending out the slides from today's presentation, so that should be in your inbox this afternoon. And with that, thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again on future webinars or at our in-person events. Have a great rest of your day.